The man looked at his practice date, beamed with a smile, and said, "We had a great date." Too bad his partner's expression did not mirror his. She looked at him and said, "Well, I'm glad you had a great date. Unfortunately, you never really bothered to ask me questions about myself." Ooh, have we done the same thing? Unfortunately, I have. I remember when I was going out with a friend or coworker for lunch one day many years ago, he said to me, "Did you know that you always somehow turn the conversation back to yourself?" And I said, "Ooh, I'm sorry." And even though it's hard to hear that feedback, I appreciate it because it stuck with me, and I learned, maybe I need to make sure I really pay attention and ask other people about themselves. My wife has had similar experiences where, a coworker would ask her questions just so that he can turn it back to himself. Like, for example, he might ask her, "Oh, where did you go to school? The university at? Oh, you were there? I was on the board of trustees there," blah, 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 just so he can make it back about himself. All of us want to be heard, and we like to know that other people are going to take interest in us as well. Sometimes people will make assumptions about others without asking. For example, some people assume that Hannah doesn't speak English just because she's Chinese and without asking. Have you ever been to a doctor who will ask, or they just automatically assume they know what is wrong with you without even bothering to ask a lot of questions and really understanding what the problems are? And I've been in organizations where leaders will try to figure out what's going wrong with the organization. But what they could have done is just simply ask people, "Hey, what do you think is wrong?" Take a survey or something like that. And there's many things we can do to really understand the world around us and ask people to find out what is the problem with things. There are many different ways we can find out about what people think. We can do surveys. You can ask people just open-ended questions. But the point is, you want to have some kind of data to back up your assumptions. I remember I was working with the church, and we did a survey to find out what the needs of the young people were. And we found that a lot of young people were they needed help with eating disorders. And I remember confronting or just sharing the information, and an elder of the church said, "We don't have problems with eating disorders here." And I said, "How do you know? Where's your data to back it up?" Unless you ask people questions, you can never know. And that's why we need surveys and research to understand and listen to the people around us. How will we ever know if our assumptions are correct unless we challenge them and ask questions? Otherwise, we could be wrong about things. And the history of psychology, unfortunately, and science in general, is replete with examples of people who made assumptions but did not ask questions. Thankfully, though, because of science, we've been able to make progress and have made advances in the fields of psychology and other health professions. But that's the benefit of science. The point of this I want you to take away from this lesson today is that the beauty of science is that it takes a humble position of listening and seeking to understand why the world is the way it is. The beauty of science is that it takes a humble attitude of listening instead of assuming. And that helps us to be more compassionate about the people we work with. Otherwise, if we just assume, then we could end up making the wrong decisions, we could diagnose things wrong, and we could have incorrect assumptions about the world. And so that's why we need to take a humane approach and really listen to people, and it'll help us to be more effective as we work with people. So that's the approach, that's what we're hoping to look at in this lesson. The main point of this lesson today is that while it may sound like science has nothing to do with people, genuine science is respectful of people. The beauty of science is that it takes an attitude of listening rather than assuming things about the world and the people in it. Genuine science can help us to be more compassionate and accepting of others, and is interested in what is effective in helping others rather than promoting our own agendas. Spiritually speaking, truth and love require each other. So in this lesson, you'll be able to describe the shift in stances from a treatment approach that simply prescribed medical interventions to an approach that sought to understand a person's own experience. And you'll be able to describe why an understanding of psychology is important for us helping us to be more compassionate and humane in treating people. And then you'll be able to describe the benefit of moving to a science-based empirical approach to mental health. And lastly, we'll describe the contributions of some early pioneers of psychology. So the first section is that we want to look at the history of insane or lunatic asylums, also known as madhouses. In ancient times, hospitals were pretty much unheard of. Hospitals, as we know it, started in Islamic Middle East during the 800s. And in Persian, they were known as Bimaristans. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but Bimaristans. They were developed in the Islamic Middle East during 800s AD. And they're fascinating because they're the prototype of modern hospitals, considering that they were, a long time ago. They had separate sections for wards for surgery, different diseases, and they had separate wards for mental illness. And the good thing about them is that they welcomed people, all people regardless of their religion or gender. They even had chapels for Christians to worship in. And they were associated with medical schools. They had a medical school at them where they trained physicians. And eventually they even licensed physicians. They had to practice an exam, or they had to pass an exam in order to be able to practice. Just much like modern medicine today. And unfortunately, our Christian medieval era wasn't necessarily so advanced. And throughout the early medieval era in Europe, the mentally ill were housed in hospital wards, monasteries, and sometimes towers. The picture here is a picture of the Hôtel de Paris, the oldest hospital in Paris, and the only hospital during the Renaissance. It was established by Saint Landry in 651 AD. You can see that, in the picture there's a crucifix and there's nuns moving around. And basically this was a church operation. Hospitals were typically run by the church's monks and nuns and provided hospitality more than they cared for sick people. And that's actually where the word hospitals come from. It was more of an inn for hospitality. And the mentally ill were often kept separate because they were considered contagious. In this picture, you can see this is in Paris, the Cathedral Notre Dame is on the left, and on the background on the right is the Hôtel Dieu on the right. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that. I don't speak French, so apologies to those who do. But that was the oldest hospital in Paris, and one of the oldest hospitals in Europe. This picture is dated 1580 during the medieval era. So now the dates jump around, but we're talking about the founding. So that hospital we just talked about goes back a ways, and we're talking about now the actual psychiatric hospitals, and those didn't start too much later, and those are dedicated to just mental health. So in 1247, the famous English psychiatric hospital, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or Bethlehem Hospital, was established outside of London. And it came to be known as Bedlam. Bedlam, unfortunately, as you know, is a word we use for confusion, disorder, basically, and noise. And that was what the madhouses of the time were known as. That's what the association was. And that's partly why we have that word now. And these types of public institutions became more and more prolific over time. And here's a picture just so you can see. This is from 1735, a 1735 illustration of London's Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam. And you can see this person depicted the various types of figures or characters you would find in an insane asylum, a lunatic asylum. You had in the middle, you had, a person who was blood-led. He has a scar on his chest. You can see crucifixes in the background. Or actually, I'm not sure if that's a crucifix, but basically you see like religious people who are looking religious. Like on the right, there's a guy who thinks he's a priest. There's a guy who's holding a violin with music on his head. And then you have a person who thinks he's an astronomer. He's got a paper rolled up and he thinks he's looking through a telescope. And you have visitors in the background. There's two women. There is apparently a picture in the middle there of a guy who thinks he's a king and he's sitting on a throne. This is basically his toilet. So those are the kinds of scenes you would see. And notice they're not in rooms, they're all just running around doing anything. And that was kind of the scene that you would see. These types of, like I said, these types of public institutions became more and more prolific and were known as madhouses or insane or lunatic asylums from 1632 until the 18th century. This is a picture of Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia. It's one of the oldest asylums in the United States and was still operating until recently. I think maybe still operating, I'm not sure. But it was one of the oldest running insane asylums in the United States. Now, these were not happy places. They were not necessarily good places to be. They weren't always very friendly to their patients. They were often like prisons, sometimes housed together with criminals. And the problem with these institutions is that they became abusive, and sometimes dissidents were locked in these institutions involuntarily to be silenced and oppressed. So physical restraints were often used, including shackles and straitjackets. On the left, this is, I believe, a picture of a girl in an asylum in Germany where she's being forced to stand. She's got shackles, making sure she stands. That was a shocking picture that got a lot of people upset. Here in the middle is a picture of some men who are in straitjackets. I believe this is from the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, I believe. And then on the right, here's another picture of a woman who's shackled to a post. She's got physical restraints on her as well. So let's talk about, now that we talked about asylums, but separately from that was the development of neurology as a field of medicine. And so that was developed between the 16th and 19th centuries until basically from 1500s to about 1800s. As seen in the previous chapter, medical practitioners have relied on neurosurgery or cutting into the head for pain relief for thousands of years, as we saw a picture from before of how people drilled holes into people's heads. Neurology began between the 16th and 19th centuries as a medical field with physicians who focused on organic brain diseases such as strokes, epilepsy, and pain management. And so that's one of the main differences from the field of psychology today. This is more focused on the organic side. It's more of a focus on the biology of the brain. And so, for example, you can see here a picture from 1543 is an atlas of the base of the brain by Flemish physician Andreas Vesalius. Thomas Willis, who lived in the 1600s, detailed the anatomy of the brain and coined the term neurology. He's the first one that came up with that term. Just a tidbit. The more important figure you want to know definitely is Jean-Martin Charcot, who lived in the 1800s, and he was considered the father of modern neurology. And he had a strong influence on psychology and psychiatry as well, even though it's a neurology. He influenced all these fields. He's very famous, and we're going to talk about him more. Here is a painting of Charcot, who is demonstrating, I believe it's hypnosis on a woman, to his listeners. And he had a large following of people who were learning medicine. Now, starting in the late 1800s, neurologists started to remove brain tumors and spinal tumors. You can see here some operating tools that neurologists used. Neurologists would treat severe mental illnesses through a lobotomy, which severs the connections to the front of the brain, known as the prefrontal cortex. And here's a man who invented a lobotomy treatment, and he's operating on a person's head right there. Now, the next phase is that we moved away from these biomedical approaches to moral treatment, and this was introduced by Pinnell and Tuke in the early 19th century, early 1800s. While biomedical approaches to mental health would continue to dominate throughout the 1800s, a more humane alternative arose at the same time. Good thing. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So in 1790, Hannah Mills, a Quaker, was admitted to the York Lunatic Asylum in England, later known as Booth End Park Hospital, for melancholy, which is now known as depression. These institutions were oppressive and often relied on methods that were tantamount to torture. Now the picture on this slide is from the Bethlehem Hospital, not the York Hospital, but you can see they have statues of, I believe it is melancholy, and I think it's rage on the right. But anyway, melancholy is what was a common diagnosis at the time, is what we now know as depression, and that's what Hannah was admitted for. Unfortunately, when her family went to visit her, the institution told them that she was unable to be visited, and a few months later, she died. While the cause of death was not determined, the family suspected mistreatment. This event inspired William Tuke, who lived around 1732 to 1822, to do something. And he also later observed another woman in mental health who was chained naked to a wall. And so he really felt like, we need to do something different. This is not working, and it's torture. So William Tuke founded moral treatment as a response to the maltreatment in the asylums of his time. As a Quaker, he wanted to create a more humane, compassionate treatment because he believed that all people were created equally under God, and as children of God were worthy of dignity and respect. That's my philosophy too. I like to think that all people are worthy of dignity and respect, and that they should be treated as such. So Tuke established the York Retreat, where kinder, gentler methods were employed. He banned the more traditional medical treatments such as bloodletting, purging, and physical restraints. Instead, he ran the retreat like a paternalistic home. And also, I would add that it was largely, he used religion as a method of treatment. And some people didn't like that, as the next guy we're going to talk about. And this picture here is an early picture of the York Retreat, dated about 1796. And you can see how it's set in a natural environment away from the city. And that was designed to help people recuperate. The French physician Philippe Pinel, who lived in 1745 to 1826, also advocated for improved conditions of psychiatric patients, and he coined the term moral treatment or therapy. It was Tuke who translated that term into English, I believe. So Pinel is the one who coined it. Tuke is the one that popularized it. And he transformed hospitals in France to be more hands-off and banning shackles and bloodletting. It's a good thing. He was also part of this moral treatment approach. He coined the term for it. And artwork from that time period celebrated his leadership in this area. So here's a picture of Dr. Philippe Pinel at the Salpêtrière. I believe this is an asylum. It's painted in 1795 by Tony Robert Fleury. Pinel is ordering the removal of chains from patients at the Paris Asylum for Insane Women. Yeah, so that's the name. That is the earlier in the name. Salpêtrière, I guess, is the name of the Paris Asylum, I assume. Anyway, Pinel, the difference between Pinel and Tuke is that Pinel was not reliant so much on religion. He just didn't want to have shackles and chains, and he felt like there needed to be a different approach. Either way, both of them contributed to the advancement of an alternative, this moral treatment. Another person that's very famous in the United States is Dorothea Dix. She lived in 1802 to 1887. She was a former school teacher who met William Tuke and later advocated for the reform of asylums in the United States. And she did a broad investigation in the state of Massachusetts, and she reported on abuses to her state legislature. And she says, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." And her publication was broadcast widely. A lot of people read it, and because of her work, she led to a broad reform of asylums in the United States. So we saw the advancement of moral treatment, which was not reliant on biomedical interventions. But we also, later, or at the same time, had a split off from that field of neurology, probably because neurology was very invested in the biomedical approach. And so we're going to take a look at that. Mental asylums were a booming business in the United States and Britain in the 1800s, as they were mostly privately run. And because they're privately run, that you can see how that could potentially lead to some abuses, as there was less oversight. The American Psychiatric Association started an association for leaders of insane asylums in 1844, probably I'm assuming to get their institutions to be on the right path and to make them sound. I'm sure they had good intentions, and that's why they started this. It was originally called the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. It was later renamed the American Psychiatric Association. A lot easier to remember, and now we know it as that. In the beginning, psychiatrists, along with neurologists, both of them, psychiatrists and neurologists, focused mostly on biomedical treatment of the psychotically disturbed and hospitalized patients using bleeding, lobotomies or psychosurgery, and tranquilizers. This was still growing strong in the 1800s. Now, an important figure that was instrumental in this change was Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, who lived in 1856 to 1939, was an Austrian neurologist. Remember that. If I was to ask you that, was Freud a psychologist or psychiatrist? No, he was actually trained as a neurologist. But because of that, he helps in the development of the other fields. He studied under the famous neurologist Charcot. Remember, who was researching hypnosis at the time. He actually studied that with Charcot. But we're going to see a change here. Freud changed directions and went on to found psychoanalysis, a talk therapy that treated mental disorders by engaging with the unconscious mind. He based this method on clinical case studies of people he treated. This is a revolutionary idea if you think about it. Essentially, Freud allowed people to talk freely and honestly, sharing their stream of thoughts, a process known as free association. Can you imagine, rather than cutting people's heads open, that he created this radical idea of listening to people? That's why this chapter is known as maybe we should try listening to people. Maybe we should try listening. This would lead to, and so Freud discovered that through listening to people, this would lead to uncovering repressed traumatic memories that, when shared, led to their healing and resolution. And so they didn't have to do all these surgeries and biomedical interventions. All he had to do is just listen to people and understand where they're coming from. That was a radical idea for his time, because I don't know if anybody had actually thought about that before. Crazy, isn't it? So while Freud himself was a neurologist, talk therapy actually gained far more traction among the psychiatrists, these owners of the leaders of the insane asylums, and it's perhaps because, remember, the influence of the moral treatment on asylums. So these people were already looking for alternatives, and so Freud's talk therapy gained more traction among psychiatrists rather than neurologists, who were more interested in the biomedical treatments, because neurologists were medical doctors, and they were bought completely into the medical model. And Freud's approach was radically different. It did not involve cutting people open. Therefore, psychiatrists moved away from the biomedical treatments early on, as they were strongly influenced by psychoanalysis, which became the predominant paradigm for outpatient psychiatrists. Now, keep in mind, psychiatrists are also medical doctors. Neurologists and psychiatrists are all medical doctors. But the difference is that psychiatrists were originally influenced by psychoanalysis. So they moved away from a reliance on surgery. That was the domain of neurology. In the 1950s and 60s, psychiatry eventually returned to its biomedical roots, and today psychiatrists are the primary prescriber of medications affecting the brain. So, as they are still medical doctors, the emphasis today in psychiatry is on medication. Although you can still find many psychiatrists who do therapy, although it's typically more rare, they typically just prescribe medicine and move on. But you'll still find many psychiatrists who do psychotherapy and some who are even trained in psychoanalysis because of the historical relationship. Now, one of the problems, as we're going to see, is that despite its positive influence, psychoanalysis still had been criticized for its lack of empirical basis and evidence for the development of its theory. Critics complained that psychoanalysis was based mostly on clinical case studies rather than quantitative and experimental research. Karl Popper, for example, criticized Freud's psychoanalysis as a pseudoscience because his claims are not testable and cannot be refuted. Freud could always just read the past differently. So despite the weaknesses, Freud may simply be guilty of overgeneralizing based on the clinical cases, but the good thing is he at least taught us to listen to people, and his observations were more qualitative in seeking to understand why his patients had problems, and perhaps he could have tested his assumptions with other methods, like quantitative methods. Otherwise, he did help us move us in the right direction of listening to what people had to say for themselves. So Freud did have a positive influence in psychiatry, despite the fact that psychoanalysis may have been a fuzzy science in the beginning. It was not really grounded in a lot of empirical, quantitative research, but he did at least listen to people, and that listening got us on the right track. That leads us to the next split, the split between psychiatry and psychology. And psychology is definitely more on the listening side. William Wundt, is a German name, lived in 1832 to 1920. He was a German physiologist and a chair of philosophy at the University of Leipzig. He was the first to call himself a psychologist. Ology means study of the mind, study of something. So psychology means study of the brain, study of the mind. And he created the first psychology lab at the Institute for Experimental Psychology, where he conducted scientific investigations on the human mind. Thus, in 1879, Wundt established psychology as a separate science of its own, distinct from philosophy in the country of Germany. So you can see psychology has a lot of influence from philosophy in the beginnings, and that's why it tends to be more on the talk side of things. But before Freud came along, people were already talking about the unconscious mind because of the popularity of mesmerism and hypnosis. Remember, Charcot was already studying hypnosis, so there was already the investigation in the unconscious. The only difference is that with Freud, his whole therapy was based on that. But Wundt was skeptical about theories based on the unconscious mind, and he preferred to focus on conscious thought. Because you can't scientifically test the unconscious. That was one of the problems, one of the criticisms of psychoanalysis, was that it was very fuzzy and hard to empirically test. Now, if you think about it, his focus was on looking at conscious thought. Have you ever thought about what goes through your mind? And maybe you can take a minute to reflect on what kinds of thoughts have gone through your mind. Maybe right now you're thinking about what I'm talking about, but when you're not listening, what kind of thoughts travel through your brain? And so he analyzed the contents of one's mind, or their stream of thoughts, through the method of objective introspection, which focuses on analyzing one's own internal thought processes. While he was critical of naive introspection, meaning you just take a quick look, he believed that one could be trained to engage in critical self-observation. That was his idea. So he believed in voluntarism, which emphasized the role of the will in organizing the brain's conscious thoughts. So the will is that ancient idea that there is some higher order, the rational
order that organizes the thoughts in the brain. Now, psychology eventually migrated from Germany to the United States, and it took on its own flavor in the United States. Edward Titchener, who lived in 1867 to 1927, was an English student of Wundt who brought psychology to the United States. He was a professor of psychology at Cornell University in New York. Titchener advanced structuralism, which focused on the structures of the basic elements of the conscious mind. So like Wundt, his mentor, he was focused on the conscious thought, but he was primarily interested in breaking the conscious thoughts down. And he used a method of introspection to investigate the science of immediate experience or consciousness. And he tried to divide our experiences into emotions and sensations, which was an interesting early beginning, and the analysis of our thoughts, our feelings, distinction between cognition and emotion. One of his students, Margaret Washburn, was the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology in 1894, and she was also the second woman after Mary Calkins to serve as the president of the American Psychological Association. So you can see the good thing about the APA is that they had some women involved in the beginning, and we're also going to see that they had people of color as well. Unfortunately, much of the history that we see tends to be old white men. That's why it's good to remember some of the other people as well. Now, in the American Psychological Association, Charles Darwin had a big influence, and Darwin continues to have a big influence over the field of psychology, especially during its beginnings. Charles Darwin was a renowned geologist and biologist who lived in 1809 to 1882, who proposed that all life descended over time from common ancestors. His theory is that through natural selection, or survival of the fittest, humans and all life forms have evolved over time. And this theory had a major impact in the early development of psychology. Dr. William James, was the founder of functionalism. He was a doctor too. And he moved away from focusing on the stream of thought like the others, like Titchener and Wundt did. Instead, he wanted to look at how the mind allows people to adapt, live, work, and play. His theory looks at the utility and purpose of the brain and behavior through Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution. So he applies evolutionary theory of natural selection to the mind and psychology. And he was interested in how the mind serves us, it helps us survive. And functionalism is known for experiments in trial and error learning by Thorndike, one of James' students. So it'll be an example of that, survival of the fittest kind of idea. The American Psychological Association was founded by G. Stanley Hall in 1892. We talked about some of the people who founded the American Psychiatry Association. Now we're talking about the American Psychological Association. That's different. The American Psychological Association was much more, is for psychology. So psychology is much more the philosophical and scientific study of the mind, not so much the medical side. And Stanley Hall was the first president of Clark University in Massachusetts. He was the first president of the APA. He had studied under William James. Remember, William James is the functional approach at Harvard University, and Wundt's psychology lab in Germany. And he was an ardent believer in Darwin's theory of evolution as well. Now, because of that, there's also some downsides to that we're going to see. Just as evolutionary psychology has had an unfortunate history, Hall also supported racial eugenics and supported separate education for men and women. Now, despite his interest in eugenics, Hall did help develop educational psychology and was interested in childhood development. So, even though he had some downsides, there was some positive things he contributed as well to the field. And together, Hall and William James also helped debunk spiritualism and proved that a medium conducting a seance was communicating with fictional characters rather than spirits of the dead. That was interesting because that was very popular in the time, and so they wanted to look at things from a scientific perspective. William James, who is, remember, he is the one who founded functionalism. He became the 3rd and the 13th president of the American Psychological Association in 1894 and then later in 1904. And he had tremendous influence in the fields of psychology and education. A student of James, Mary Whiten Calkins, became the first female president of the APA in 1905. So that would be, she's not the first president, but she's the first female president, and that was in 1905. So we have, as you can see, we had a diversity of contributors to the field of psychology. This young profession, the field of psychology is actually very young. If you compare it to like neurology and then psychiatry, psychology was founded after the American Civil War, and so is slightly more progressive. Slightly, it was founded in 1879 in Germany and 1892 in the United States. Many of the psychology's early pioneers included women and minorities, and African Americans made important contributions to the field. Unfortunately, I can only summarize here, but I will try to discuss some of the contributions. Dr. Francis Cecil Sumner, he was the first African American with a PhD in psychology. He founded the psychology department at Howard University. Then there's Dr. Inez Beverly Prosser. She's the first African American woman with a PhD in psychology. And she actually argued that segregation was better for black students. Dr. Albert Sidney Beckham, he was an educational psychologist who studied race and IQ. And he found that IQ scores and socioeconomic status were correlated. So he was the one who argued against this idea that, African Americans were inferior because somehow their IQ scores were lower. He pointed out that socioeconomic status was the main contributing factor to why the IQ scores were different. Then there was Dr. Charles Henry Thompson. He was the first African American to get a PhD in educational psychology. He was a professor and dean at Howard University for 40 years. He was a prolific writer. So, near to us in D.C., we have Howard University, who had major contributors to the field of psychology. And then Dr. Ruth Winifred Howard Beckham, who's, I wonder if she's related to the earlier Dr. Beckham. I need to find out more about that. And she was one of the first African American women to get a PhD in psychology and child development. And she emphasized work with children with special needs. So, and there are more I could list, but these are the only ones I could fit. Many others as well who had important contributions. Now, there are 3 influential approaches in the history of modern psychology that we're going to look at. The first main influence, as we've seen, was psychoanalysis. And that is a theory and therapy based on the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that the unconscious mind controls much of our conscious behavior. And psychoanalysis treatment focuses on developing insight into the unconscious and early childhood experiences. And through free association, the therapist remains quiet and allows the patient to unconsciously transfer or project feelings about other people onto the therapist. And this transference is part of the healing process. So they actually intentionally allow themselves to be a blank slate for their patients to project thoughts onto. At the APA's first conference, who, as you remember, led by G. Stanley Hall, the 1909 Clark Conference, G. Stanley Hall invited Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who is a protege or follower of Freud, who also diverged from Freud. He invited Freud and Carl Jung to speak, even though Hall and his American colleagues considered psychoanalysis as pseudoscience. Because remember, they were more interested in observable things, or things that could be scientifically tested, like the conscious, and they didn't think the unconscious was falsifiable. But Freud had a major impact on the field. Psychoanalysis had such a strong influence in the field that this has led to the perception that psychology is a softer, fuzzier science. And today, psychologists are more likely to engage in talk therapy, so that's a good thing. Thanks to Freud, we would say that there's much more interest in listening to people and talking to people and just understanding what people have to think for themselves. While psychiatrists are the ones who exclusively prescribe medications. So psychologists are not medical doctors. They're more scientists, you could say, or they might be counselors or people who take a more philosophical approach, and they're the ones who would interview the people that they work with. While psychiatrists are the ones who prescribe medicines. So you have to keep that in mind. The second main influence in modern psychology comes from Gestalt psychology. Again, another German approach. And this is from Max Wertheimer, who lived in the 1800s, 1943, and Kurt Kafka, who lived in 1886 to 1941. These two were early Gestalt psychologists who believed that human behavior and experience could not be reduced to basic elements. As you can see, there's some pictures that we're going to talk more about when we get to perception and sensation. These are pictures of shapes that the mind completes. And the idea is that, if you just break it down into the parts, you would miss the overall picture. And Gestalt says that, well, let's go on the next slide. In Gestalt, they emphasize that the principle that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Meaning, in contrast to introspection, which tried to break down the components of conscious thought, in Gestalt, they say, you can't really break things down because you'd miss the bigger picture. So Gestalt is a German word that really means an organized whole. So this is a field that focuses not only on perception, but also how we learn, on memory, thought processes, and problem solving. Its ideas have been incorporated into the study of cognitive psychology. The founder of Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls, so remember, Gestalt psychology and Gestalt therapy are different, but Gestalt therapy is based on Gestalt psychology. The founder of Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls, who lived about that time, 1893 to 1970, initially was trained in psychoanalysis, like Freud's psychoanalysis, but he developed Gestalt therapy in reaction to it. But we can still see some influence. In both Gestalt therapy and psychoanalysis, the therapist remains relatively quiet enough to allow the patient to project unconscious feelings. They might use different language, but they still remain somewhat quiet. But the difference is that while psychoanalysts would keep themselves out of it, a Gestalt therapist would use their own presence. They wouldn't always stay quiet. They would use their own presence and their experience in therapy. So while psychoanalysts took an expert role of diagnosing and investigating the person, the patient, a Gestalt therapist saw themselves more in mutual dialogue and relationship with their clients. In Gestalt, the focus is more on present awareness, whereas in psychoanalysis, the focus is more on the unconscious and past experience. So again, Gestalt is more focused on the present, and they might be more focused on conscious thought, but rather than trying to break things down, they would be more interested in the overall picture. They're interested in how people make meaning. And so the past might be relevant. They're not necessarily ruling it out. The unconscious might be relevant, but more in how it manifests itself in the present experience. And the third main influence is behaviorism. John B. Watson, who lived in 1878 to 1958, wanted to make psychology a science again. So remember, behaviorists thought that the focus on, the unobservable unconscious was not falsifiable. So many people criticize it more of a pseudoscience. So Watson wanted to make it a science, again, by getting away from the whole subject of consciousness. Instead, he proposed a science of behavior called behaviorism, which focused only on the study of observable stimuli and responses. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, one of his assistants, I believe, demonstrated that a phobia could be learned by conditioning in their Little Albert experiment. So we saw three influences on modern psychology. They were psychoanalysis, Gestalt psychology, and behaviorism. Now today, we have different perspectives that are all shaped by these, but we have modern perspectives in the field of psychology. And I'm just going to summarize these. These are the psychodynamic, behavioral, humanist, cognitive, sociocultural, biopsychological, and the evolutionary perspectives. The psychodynamic perspective follows the psychoanalytic tradition of looking at the unconscious in early development. So it's the same pretty much. It has less emphasis on Freud's psychosexual desires that he talks about. He talks a lot about the repression of sexuality. But they put more emphasis on the self and the development of self. In the behavioral approach, the behavioral perspective continued on with its look at how behavior is conditioned. And B.F. Skinner introduced concepts of reinforcement to behaviorism. And so, there's things like classical conditioning, and that was with Pavlov's dogs, which we're going to look at. But Skinner introduced the idea of operant conditioning, of voluntary behavior, and that became a major force in the behavioral field in the 20th century. The next approach is a humanist perspective. Humanists held that the view that people have a free will and the freedom to choose their own destiny. And it developed as a reaction to the mechanistic view of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, and emphasized, so even though behaviorism thought it was superior to psychoanalysis, the humanists thought of behaviorism as too mechanistic, and that humans have this potential for growth, and they have freedom to choose, and they're not just machines. So Gestalt therapy also, the therapy approach also incorporated this philosophy into its approach to treatment. Then the cognitive paradigm. This perspective focuses on memory, intelligence, perception, problem solving, and learning. It also includes the field of cognitive neuroscience. Then we have the socio-cultural perspective. This combines two areas of study, social psychology and cultural psychology. I study social psychology, and that's looking at how society and culture influences our specific behaviors, our individual behaviors. So it looks at people in their context. So it helps situate individuals in their social and cultural context. The next perspective is the biopsychological perspective, and this is closely related to neurobiology. It emphasizes the biological basis of behavior and attributes human and animal behavior to biological processes occurring in the body, such as genetic influences, also known as heredity, hormones, and the activity of the nervous system through neurotransmitters. All of these make up the biological influences on behavior. So genes, hormones, and neurotransmitters. The evolutionary perspective sees behavior as having an adaptive or survival value, and it focuses on the biological basis of universal mental characteristics that all humans share. It looks at how behavior is adaptive, and it looks at people surviving in their context. So those are the major paradigms today. This, as you can see, an overview. Now, who does these things? We're going to just talk briefly, and we're almost done. We'll talk briefly about the professions. We introduced you to some of these professions, but we'll just go over the professions again from an overview perspective. Psychiatrists are medical doctors who provide diagnosis, therapy, medication. So keep that in mind. We talked about, actually all of these are doctors in the sense that they all have to have an advanced education with a PhD or medical doctor. The only difference is that psychiatrists are in the medical model, so they're medical doctors, whereas psychologists have doctorates of philosophy, a philosophy doctorate. So those are PhDs. Psychiatrists are MDs, psychologists are PhDs. And so or a PsyD, those are the professional level doctorate. A psychologist is a professional with an advanced academic degree and specialized training which may allow them to do counseling, teaching, or research. Psychologists are more likely to engage in talk therapy, while psychiatrists are the ones who exclusively prescribe medications. So while psychologists may do counseling or therapy, it's not the only thing they do. In fact, in one survey, only 34% do clinical work and 13% do counseling. Many do research, pretty much research and scientific research. So while psychologists may do counseling, that's not the only thing they do. You can see there's a long list of subfields in psychology. There's clinical psychology, counseling, but there's developmental psychology that looks at how humans change over time, social psychology, which looks at humans in the context of their society and culture. There's personality, which looks at how we describe humans and their personality. We have health psychology, which looks at the interaction between our health and our minds, our mental health. Then there's industrial or organizational psychology, which looks at how how psychological principles are applied in organizational work settings. And then there's sports psychology that applies psychological principles to sports. Experimental psychology is basically research that conducts experiments. And then I think development is repeated twice here. And then we have child psychology, which is focused on children. Similarly, there's educational psychology, which could be applied to children, but it could also extend as far as college and beyond. So it's more focused on how do people learn. And then there's animal psychologists, and then there's psychology that is applied to marketing and advertising. People want to know how best to sell their products. So you might ask yourself, what kinds of research questions would these professionals be interested in answering? They'll have different fields of research, and they go about conducting scientific research that is specific to their areas. So not just counseling, they also do research. And lastly, there's other kinds of mental health professionals besides those that require doctorates. As we know, there's psychologists and psychiatrists. Those are doctoral level professionals. But there's also professionals who only need a master's or a bachelor's degree. The fields that require a master's degree include mental health counselor, the professional clinical counselor, marriage and family therapist. That's what I do. I have a PhD in it, but I only need a master's to practice. Then there are those who are chaplains and pastoral counselors. And then there are mental health professionals that only need a bachelor's or associate's degree. And those include clinical social workers, psychiatric nurses, applied behavior analysts, and drug and alcohol counselors.
So in conclusion, we've seen some overall trends in the fields of psychology, and we can see how the field has become more compassionate as it's become informed by science. And there's been benefits and downsides to the role of spirituality. On one hand, religion and spirituality has helped the mental health fields to be more compassionate and humane in its approach to people. On the other hand, sometimes religion has short-circuited our assumptions and caused us to make moralistic judgments about people. And one of the benefits of science is it helps us to understand the world as is without assuming or judging the way things ought to be. On the other hand, sometimes science has brought in things that weren't always good, such as scientific racism and pseudosciences that appear like science, but not necessarily are so. So that's one of the downsides. But thankfully, as things have evolved and the conversations between faith and science, we've developed more compassionate ways to work with people. And there are some domains that we would look at when we work with a holistic approach to people. There's the cognitive or thought side of people, the emotional sides, the physical side, the behavioral side, and the spiritual domain, as well as the social, cultural, and environmental context. And that's all we're going to look at today. That will lead us to the spiritual perspective next. That's what we'll talk about. When I lived in Loma Linda, California, I had some health problems so that I needed to see a lot of doctors. In the process, I discovered that many doctors are very caring and have noble motivations to enter a career that serves humanity. On the other hand, I also discovered several doctors were not very compassionate and seemed to have other motivations. I remember two doctors specifically who I saw at different times about pain that I had. Both of them looked at my medical history and saw anxiety listed on my chart. So thus they automatically assumed that anxiety was the sole cause of my pain, and without asking any more questions, they came back with their conclusions already. The urgent care doctor even swirled his finger around his ear and suggested that my pain was all in my mind. I was very frustrated as I knew exactly what just happened. Certainly, anxiety can cause problems, but just because I suffer from panic attacks, which is not the same as generalized anxiety, did not mean that every pain I had was imagined. In fact, more compassionate doctors confirmed the sources of the pain, which included a kidney stone. So, we have what we might call professional narcissism. This kind of narcissism is common among highly educated professionals, including doctors, lawyers, and even pastors. It's very tempting to think that just because we know a lot, that we have all the answers and do not need to listen to people. In his book, Medical Errors and Medical Narcissism by Dr. Banja, he writes that the danger with this narcissism is that it allows professionals to carelessly misdiagnose and make medical errors and fail to disclose the possibility of errors to patients.
Thus, they must preserve the image of perfection. Unfortunately, society often puts these educated professionals on pedestals and expects no less than perfection, which reinforces narcissism as a survival strategy. Pride and a lack of compassion and listening is what prevents us from being able to help people effectively. Shannon Casey, in an article on the subject in 2019, wrote, "Medical narcissism is, by definition, the antithesis of patient-centered care. The psychological needs of the healthcare provider are prioritized even at the expense of the patient." This reminds me of the story of the Good Samaritan. What good is it is being an expert in something if you do not care about people? What good is having knowledge or truth without compassion? Luke, in chapter 10 and 25 through 37, records an encounter with Jesus and a lawyer, or an expert of the law. While his question was about spirituality, Christ's response has broad application. The lawyer asked, "Well, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" So Jesus appealed to his expertise and asked, "Well, what is written in the law?" And the lawyer responded, "Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and all your strength and all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself." This was the perfect answer as it pertains to compassion. The issue is whether the lawyer was applying what he knew in his mind to his actions. Is he living up to his knowledge? And when Jesus said, "Do this," the lawyer got defensive and wanted to justify himself. So Jesus shared with him this parable of the Good Samaritan. He said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I will return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" That's Luke 10, verses 30 and 35. So Jesus asked the lawyer, who was the good neighbor? The priest and the Levite were considered the most powerful, respected, highly educated members of society. Today we could include physicians, judges, and even psychologists. And sometimes professionals are in such a rush to do their noble work that they do not actually take time to listen and care for people. For example, many doctors have to rush between medical appointments that they do not have the time to really listen to people, which can increase the risks of misdiagnosing people. Unfortunately, narcissism is more concerned with appearances, status, and power, and less concerned about the least among us. In the story of the Good Samaritan, the one who was most effective in helping was the one who cared and took a risk to help someone of a different race and class. So there's limits of knowledge. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but what good is it if you don't do anything with it? Sometimes it takes life experiences to truly help us understand and empathize with people. When I was a single therapist, I remember nitpicking a married couple because they had small little spats. But I was surprised when they were still holding hands. Later, when our baby was born early and we visited him daily in a neonatal intensive care unit, I looked for people who could support me emotionally through the process. The best support I found were not from professionals, but rather from others who had no academic training, but people who had gone through similar experiences, because they were far more empathetic and encouraging. That brings me to the next point. Truth is relational. Truth requires love. An educated-looking man leaned forward and argued his point with another class member. "That's crazy. That's not what love is." Then he proceeded to give a lofty definition of love to the class. People in my class reacted in a defensive and argumentative way. And as a young student, I found myself being pulled into the debate simply because I love debates. I was raised in a Virginia public school environment that encouraged students to think critically by debating with each other. I noticed all the participants in this class were excellent debaters, and I was very tempted to engage and improve my debating skills too. But while I was watching this exchange, I was struck by the irony of it all. that we were angrily debating the meaning of love and yet missing the whole point of love during our class discussion. I realized that somewhere along the way we missed the point. While professionals and leaders in training might learn important intellectual truths and receive skills to analyze cases, we may miss the larger, more important point that what is even more important is how the leader or professional is growing, experiencing, and creating relationships with the world around them. The training of professionals should involve the whole person, involving the mind, body, heart, and spirit. Truth is more than a list of ideas and concepts. According to the Bible, truth and love need each other as they have a symbiotic relationship. Real truth needs love. Without love and compassion for people, truth becomes a harmful lie. It leads to pride, arrogance, and condescension. Truth without love turns into self-righteousness. We lose our effectiveness. So rather, we are to speak the truth in love. There's a popular saying attributed to different people. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The Apostle Paul wrote, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And this is consistent with Ellen White's counsel. She says, great wisdom is needed in dealing with diseases caused through the mind. A sore, sick heart, a discouraged mind needs mild treatment. Sympathy and tact will often prove a greater benefit to the sick than will the most skillful treatment given in a cold, indifferent way. In addition, it is not possible to truly know someone and understand them, which requires time and listening, without loving them and caring about them. So truth cannot be separated from love. Genuine compassion motivates us to slow down and listen to people, which enables us to be more effective in our work with people. And that's why I teach for an educational system that puts an emphasis on developing people who are not just leaders, but who are compassionate, moral leaders in their communities. That leads us to the next point. We need to recognize our limits. We are not gods. The antidote to narcissism is recognizing our limits. We're not gods, and we are not the ultimate heroes of the world. Why is this helpful then? Well, this takes the pressure off of us to be perfect in everything we do, which allows us to be humble and admit our potential for mistakes. But unfortunately, society does not make this easy. When pastors admit that they're imperfect, they frequently face backlash from their parishioners. If doctors admitted their mistakes, they might get sued or have patients go elsewhere. People want us to be their gods, and yet we're not. The psychiatrist Alan Berger writes, as quoted by Casey, Dr. Berger writes, the patient's longing for an omnipotent physician or parent or God to save them taps into the latent arrogance, grandiosity, or hubris of some physicians. So people put us on pedestals, put professionals on pedestals because they're ultimately looking for God to save them. But we're not. We're not God. Ultimately, we need an innkeeper. The Good Samaritan could not heal the victim by himself. It was not a quick fix. Hospitals did not even exist back then. So he took the victim to an inn and paid to have the innkeeper look after him. So like the Good Samaritan, we need to take people to the innkeeper too, as we're not God. In this story, the inn represents both physical and spiritual healing. When we ignore the spiritual side of people, then we're essentially feeding our narcissism as if we are their God. Let me just share with you an example. I once saw a woman who kept coming to me because of a boyfriend who kept misleading her. Deep down inside, she knew this man was not faithful to her, and yet she continued to pursue him. We were not making progress. And I would not normally make this connection, but because I knew she identified as a Christian, I asked her out of the blue a random question. I asked her, by the way, how is your relationship with God? She paused, looked at me, and started to weep. We discovered that her issue is not so much her boyfriend, but her relationship with God. We would not have discovered that in a quick session, but it was only after taking time to ask questions did we uncover the real issue. So we want to pay attention to healing the whole person. Jesus knew what it was like to have a full caseload of people to help. One day he was teaching in a house that became so crowded that there was no standing room even outside the door. People were so desperate to see him that they started making an opening in the roof of the house. And then 4 men lowered a friend of theirs, a paralyzed man, down through the roof to see Jesus. That's how desperate they were. While everyone expected Jesus to help the paralyzed man walk again, he first instead said, "Son, be cheerful. Your sins are forgiven." That made some onlookers accuse him of blasphemy. Jesus, why did Jesus go to the sins and not heal him physically? Jesus could not boldly talk about forgiveness if he did not care about him. We also do not read any objections from the patient, so obviously it seems like it hit where the need was. It seems that Jesus knew that the paralyzed man was really in need of God. He could have worked a miracle first and missed the whole point. And instead, he did not make it about his abilities. And that could have just fed some narcissism if it was all about showing off magical powers or whatever. Instead, he made it about his needs. But thankfully, Jesus did go on to help him walk again. So he didn't just only focus on the spirituality to the neglect of the physical. He also helped him walk again, thankfully. But likewise, we need to take the time to look past the fog and see what the real issue is in people's lives. Sometimes people do need physical healing, but sometimes the need is more spiritual. We do not neglect either the physical or the spiritual side of people. So when we care about people, we look at the whole person. As we'll see in the future, spirituality is also another component of many people's lives. It is included in a whole person approach to psychology and mental health. Spiritual issues are often at the heart of people's problems. Some people use religious beliefs as an excuse to justify negative behavior, but religious beliefs can also create fear and shame too. Some of the psychological paradigms also have spiritual implications. For example, some therapy models such as humanist Gestalt therapy or mindfulness-based therapy draw some Buddhist ideas about awareness and radical acceptance. Gestalt therapy seems to talk about people being a whole system, as Gestalt means an organized whole. A whole person approach is also consistent with Christian theology, which we'll see. For example, in 1 Corinthians, there's what he says. In 1 Corinthians 12, verse 25, Paul writes, "There should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. Therefore, the health of our brain should be just as equal in importance to the health of the rest of our body, as they're all part of the same whole. We do not divide up the body into this and that. All are important." Lastly, religious beliefs have played a role in the development of compassionate models of treatment. So as we saw with the moral treatment, religion was helpful in that sense. It helps people to think more compassionately about people. But love also requires truth. And that's why science is also important. We don't want to be ignorant either. If we care about people, we also want to know the truth because we want to know what is effective and what is fair or not. We do not want to ignore scientific evidence about what works and what does not work. As the Bible says, genuine love rejoices with the truth. And in God, mercy and truth have met together. But what is truth? And as I mentioned, it's relational, but what is truth? As Socrates discovered, one can have a lot of truth and at the same time be devoid of it. We can become blinded by our own confidence in knowing the truth, which is why Paul writes, "The one who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know," 1 Corinthians 8. Furthermore, everyone who thinks they have the right truth when their understanding or interpretation of the truth can be distorted by their own preconceived biases. So the question of truth is found in the gospel story. When Jesus was taken before Pontius Pilate, lies were being told about him. Then Pilate sought to find out the truth for himself. John recounts, Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus asked, "All right, is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "Ha, you're a king then," said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king? In fact, the reason why I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And so here's a classic question. What is truth? Retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. This is from John 18:33-38. Pilate was looking for a propositional truth when the reality is that propositional truths often lead to conflicts. Meanwhile, truth stood before him. Truth, like wisdom, is about action. It's relational. Perhaps that's why Paul wrote that all other knowledge was worthless. He wrote, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection. That's the kind of truth that is relational and it's transformative. And when we know that, all other truth becomes really truth. Because without love, truth becomes a lie. So I hope you join us for our next session coming up, Chapter 4, Thinking Like a Scientist. And so we talked a lot about how having an attitude of listening and caring about people opens up our minds to asking questions. And then what do we do with that? And that's where Thinking Like a Scientist is helpful. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.